Welcome to Teaching 8th Grade U.S. History. This is session 6. And today we have the chance to go through the upcoming unit, which is Unit 6. So we are going to go ahead and dive right in. Just quick introductions. I'm Molly Gale. I'm one of the social studies consultants at Oakland Schools. And my colleagues are Stacy Woodward and Chris Lee. So before we dive into Unit 6, this is just an update on the full day in-person professional learning that we talked about at the last couple of sessions. That session is ready to go. So it's an in-person full day workshop on teaching Reconstruction. And it is going to be led by Facing History and Ourselves. We're really excited about it. It will take place on March 20th, and there will be some asynchronous pre-work that accompanies that first session. So if you are interested, make sure you visit our SMORE, and right at the top of it, you'll see information about how to register. And there will actually also then be a follow-up Zoom session where we can talk about how Unit 9 is going in your classroom, which will be on April 19th from 7 to 8:30 p.m. So we would love to see you there. Please make sure you register soon because space is limited. Okay, so as we dive in here, I want you to just take a look at this graphic organizer and think about how this is similar to or different from how you usually teach this unit. You'll notice on the graphic organizer, and this is the graphic organizer for the unit as a whole, that it's really focusing on some key reform movements. So it's going to address education reform, temperance, labor reform, prison reform. And then at the end of the unit, it addresses abolition and women's rights and suffrage. And as students analyze these different reform movements, they're not just looking at what happened, they're looking at what strategies and tactics these reformers used that were effective. Throughout the unit, as they investigate each one of these, they're also taking a look at what injustice these reformers were trying to address, as well as how those aligned with our national ideals, and what those reformers were attempting to achieve. So just a reminder where we have been. At this point, we have gone through units 1 through 5. So when we last met, we talked about Unit 5, which the compelling question was, can a divided nation be united? And students really had a chance to look at sectionalism. They had a chance to look at what was going on in the North, what was going on in the South. They looked pretty deeply at the Industrial Revolution. And at this point, students are now merging into the early to mid 1800s when they really are having a chance to look at society. So in the last unit, they spent quite a bit of time on economics, on politics, and on geography. In this unit, we're really asking them to take a deeper dive to look at these social movements that were happening in society and what was really transforming in the country in the 1800s. So this unit, which again, you'll notice in the pacing guide, takes 3 weeks of time. They're going to look at these reform movements, and this unit is leading them into Unit 7, where they're really looking at the path to the Civil War. So when they get to Unit 7, they're diving deeply into those events that occurred on the path to the Civil War as they investigate the compelling question, which is, why did the Civil War break out when it did? So Unit 6, the compelling question that kids are investigating over these 3 weeks is, what does it take to build justice in a democratic society? So this is an idea that kids have talked about throughout their education, and they have a chance to really look at it closely now and not just examine what happened, but to look at what does it take to build justice? So what were the strategies and tactics that were most successful? So just to give you an idea of what we were thinking about as we created this unit, to give you some idea of our framing, because I think that's helpful as you're heading into teaching it. One thing we wanted to make sure we did when we sat down to work with this unit was we wanted to make sure we set up an opportunity for kids to analyze reform movements from the early to mid 1800s. So these are ones like prison reform, education reform, temperance, abolitionism, and women's rights. But we wanted to move past kids just telling us what occurred, and we want to really encourage them to look at which strategies and tactics the reformers used and which were most effective, because we do know that some were more effective than others. Throughout the unit, we are working to continue building students' disciplinary reading, writing, and thinking skills. So in this unit, which we'll look at in a minute, We include another investigation from Read, Inquire, Write, which gives students a chance to read a series of documents, to analyze those documents and to craft an authentic argument. And then we actually also wanted to make sure that we focused on Michigan's role in the Underground Railroad. So often when abolitionism is taught, we look at the Underground Railroad, but we lose sight of the very important role of local history. So we wanted to tell that story here and give kids a chance to explore that story. And last but not least, as we look at the women's rights movement, we wanted to really tell a more comprehensive history than has been traditionally told. So these were the things we had in mind as we crafted these 3 weeks. And I'm going to show you the lesson layout so you can get a feel for the layout of the unit. So as students are seeking to answer that compelling question, what does it take to build justice in a democratic society? These are the lessons they work through. So in lesson 1, they look at what were some of the responses to injustice in the mid-1800s, and they have a chance to look at several of the reform movements that were occurring. In lesson 2, we're really getting them ready for lesson 3, which is that Read, Inquire, Write investigation. In lesson 2, they get introduced to a number of abolitionists. So the lesson question is, who were the well-known abolitionists and what motivated them? In lesson 3, the students really dig into the movement, and they actually answer a really interesting and relevant question, which is, which sources should be taught in schools to best tell the story of how abolitionists thought and interacted as they tried to end slavery? Lesson 4, the students look at that hidden story of Michigan's role in the Underground Railroad, which I think as teachers as well, you'll find really interesting. And lesson 5 is the last lesson in the unit, and it's an inquiry as well. And this one is written in the IDM blueprint from the C3 framework. And it's structured to take place over several days. The question kids are looking at is, how should the history of the women's rights movement be remembered? So how should we remember? This is an enduring question of the discipline, and we're giving kids a chance to really dive into that. So I'm going to take you through a guided tour of the unit, just like we did the last couple of times we met. So lesson 1, the question again is, what were some of the responses to injustice in the mid-1800s? And the big ideas are right there if you want to take a look through them right now. This is, as the first lesson of the unit, a chance to really set kids up, introduce them to the unit compelling question, and then this lesson question, and give them the tools they need to dive into both. So the lesson starts with the students actually doing a QFT of a bunch of these images, which they're going to see throughout the unit. So this is kind of nice. They get to preview these and ask some questions about them. Some of these are probably familiar to them and others will not be. Then they actually revisit this word that, of course, they've heard in previous years, which is justice. And we talk about justice as a hallmark of a democratic society. And the students have a chance to journal about areas of society that have lacked and continue to lack justice. Then we introduce students to the unit graphic organizer. So like in other units, this is the graphic organizer where they can gather information every lesson as they learn to try to build an argument to that unit compelling question. And you'll notice it's set up where students note the reform movement. They know what did they view as the injustice, the reformers, what were their goals, what were their strategies and tactics, and then last but not least, did they achieve their goals? So as students dive into the meat of this lesson, the first thing they do is they learn about the role of the Second Great Awakening, and that's through some quick direct instruction. The next thing they do is they actually do a little bit of background reading. They read about education reform and prison reform, and as they do, they fill in a graphic organizer. After they filled in the graphic organizer, they actually review a copy together so they can check their answers. And for instance, they look at ideas such as the creation of funding of public schools, but they focus also on the continued denial of education to both free and enslaved Black Americans. Then they read a second article where they look at prison reform, and we make sure they also revisit those disciplinary thinking skills and reading skills. So they do some sourcing questions as they dig into that article. At the end of that first day of this lesson, they actually get a chance to take what they've learned about reformers so far, and they create a tableau with their group, which is a frozen scene about one of the group's reformers. So this just shows you, gives you a little bit of an idea of what they're filling out as they go. And what students finally do is they read another article about reform movements. And they add some new information. So this one is going to layer in some additional information about those reform movements they had just read about. And they're going to have a chance to reflect. Let me go back for one sec. They're going to have a chance to reflect on what the benefit is of reading two articles. So this is time for students to actually think a little more meta and think, why do historians make sure that they rely on more than just one source? At the end of that, students have a chance to get up and get active. They take part in conversation lines to discuss the reading of these two articles and the different strategies and tactics that they address. To give you an idea as the teacher, some of the strategies that kids are introduced to in this first day of the lesson are pushing for legislation. That was a key strategy. Founding colleges, public speaking, selecting capable leaders for their movements. Some of them founded societies, some of them published pamphlets, some of them organized strikes. So the idea is not that kids memorize all of these strategies and tactics, but is that they start to see that there were a wide range of actions that these historical figures took to try to bring about change. So lesson one is really kind of getting their feet wet. They're learning about these general reform movements. They're charting some of them specifically in terms of strategies and tactics. On day two, we really start digging into the abolition movement. And lesson two is more or less setting up the read, inquire, write investigation in lesson three, but it's really important in helping to get kids prepped so they're ready to take on that investigation in lesson three. The first thing we have them do at the beginning of the lesson is we have them recall what prior knowledge they have from the inquiry they did about slavery at the end of Unit 5. So as you recall, at the end of Unit 5, they did a full and a pretty robust investigation, an inquiry on slavery in the US. So we have them recall prior knowledge just to situate everybody. And then we ask them to envision an abolitionist just from what they know in the past. This might be in 5th grade if they learned briefly about abolitionism, and to journal some descriptive words. What we then do is we show them some photos of abolitionists, and you can see that right here on the screen. And we ask students how these photos either challenge or confirm their thinking. The next thing we do is we really want to situate students globally. So this is a global context. We have the kids look at a timeline and draw some conclusions about it. And what they're able to see is that abolitionism was not a uniquely American thing. In fact, as you can see, really other countries were quite a bit ahead of the US. We then walk kids through, and this is a little bit of direct instruction and a little bit of interactive discussion. We actually have them, we call it meeting 12 abolitionists. So they get to go through and really learn about 12 people who played a pivotal role in trying to end slavery. As they learn about each one, they have a graphic organizer where they track the strategies and tactics that person used, as well as the motivations for that person, what motivated them to enter the movement, because their motivations were not all the same. We do include a teacher guide for this, which is completely filled in so that as the instructor, you already have that information and you're not racing to try to compile that at the same time as you're prepping this lesson. After they've met all of these abolitionists, and that's a snapshot of the teacher guide. After they've met these abolitionists, we ask kids to compare and contrast the backgrounds and dispositions of these abolitionists through creating a Venn diagram. So they get to choose which 3 of the 12, and they get to compare and contrast their backgrounds, their dispositions. For students who are ready for a slightly more challenging Venn diagram, we do provide a 4-part Venn diagram as well, which, as you can imagine, gets a little more complex. Kids have a chance to do a gallery walk of their Venn diagrams, which is fun because they won't all pick the same people. So it gives them a little more exposure, again, to analysis of all 12. And then we ask them to go back at the end of the lesson and to revise their original journal entry where they described an abolitionist. At the end of the lesson, the kids add to their unit graphic organizers any new learning they have, and then they're ready to really take on lesson 3. So lesson 3 is an investigation from Read, Inquire, Write, which we've talked about in prior sessions. Read, Inquire, Write is a wonderful resource out of the University of Michigan that's really centered specifically on middle school. So it's only for 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And it's really focused on teaching kids how to read and think in social studies, and how to do that through disciplinary reading and writing skills. They read across documents, they analyze those documents, they weigh the evidence, and then they construct an authentic argument. So these investigations do not end in a 5-paragraph essay. They end in an actual authentic piece of writing that somebody in the discipline might do. This investigation, of course, is centered on abolitionism. The question that drives it is, which source or sources should be taught in schools to best tell the story of how abolitionists thought and interacted as they tried to end slavery? So it's not asking kids to tell us, well, what did the abolitionists do? It's asking them, which sources should we be putting in schools to teach kids about the abolitionist movement? On Atlas, everything you need to teach this investigation is included. So there's the bookmark tool, which we've talked about before, and we'll talk about again in a minute. They have the sort cards. There's a full teacher guide. There's the complete student source packet with all of the sources already adapted and ready to go, and a writing rubric. So there's really everything you need is already in there. It is designed to be a scaffolded 5-day lesson that's going to guide kids through analyzing sources and then writing an evidence-based argument. And there again is a teacher note with teacher facilitation notes for each source, and it does give ideas of how to shorten the investigation if you need to for the sake of time. So it tells you exactly which sources to choose if you're not going to do all of the sources. And last but not least, I think one of the best parts of these are the slide decks. So you have a full 5 days of slide decks already created for you and ready to go. So you're all set to implement. There's nothing you need to create on your end. So as they dive into the first day of this investigation, they review what they learned from lesson 2, of course. And then day 1 is really about building background knowledge. So they've already started to do that in lesson 2, and in lesson 3, they get to expand that a little bit. They get introduced to the word cards. They get introduced to the enduring argument over schools and what resources should be taught in schools. So they get to look at some of these headlines that have just been pulled from recent years. This is a real debate that's going on right now in society, and they get to think about, why is there an argument over what schools teach and what resources are taught, and what role might they play in helping to make those selections. They then take a look at a drawing, and they think about how Northerners and Southerners might have responded to that drawing. They look at misconceptions then about how abolitionism is taught. The way it is framed in this investigation is that as part of the 1619 project, there was an article about why slavery is mistaught or worse in American schools, and they asked readers to write in their experiences about learning about slavery. And what they found is that there were a lot of problematic and inaccurate things going on in public schools. At the same time, people in America today often mistakenly believe that white people freed the slaves, and they pay very little attention to the role of Black abolitionists. So students, for instance, have a chance to look at this, which is a snapshot from the PBS documentary. And they look at maybe who is missing here. When you look at this, is that an accurate representation of the abolitionist movement? And you can see these are some of the photographs of the authors they're about to read in the investigation. So the student's assignment is to write a letter to the 1619 project about which sources should be taught in schools to best tell the story of how abolitionists thought and interacted as they tried to end slavery. Once again, the students have the bookmark tool to help them analyze the sources, just like in the prior investigation. And we're really getting kids to think about how abolitionists were thinking and working together and interacting together. So on day 2, students dive into the actual source analysis. This is an example of source 1. So this is David Walker's speech, and you can see, just like we've talked about before, there's a head note provided for the source. It's already adapted. So in this case, it's certainly shortened. They have the attribution at the bottom. And the teacher will start with modeling how to analyze the source using the bookmark tool. And then the students work in pairs to continue analyzing sources for really the rest of day 2 and most of day 3. So students are going to work their way through these sources using the graphic organizer included. And at the end of day 3, once they've read these sources and thought about them a little bit, they have a chance to really pull back and weigh the evidence. So in the weigh the evidence activity, students are, I'm going to go back to here. In the weigh the evidence activities, students have a chance to sort the evidence based on different prompts. They look, for instance, at which sources agree with each other and which sources seem to disagree with each other. They look at which sources are most useful for them to answer the lesson question and which maybe are least useful. They also look at like which sources were written by authors who had similar identities. What they do then at the end of day 3 is they construct a class anchor chart. They brainstorm as a class possible claims, evidence, reasoning, counterclaims, and critiques. So this is really nice because kids get a chance to think together and to share, and you chart them out as the teacher. And then they look at that class anchor chart and they look at which arguments they think are the strongest, which are the weakest, and why. So when they leave day 3, they've had a chance to brainstorm collaboratively to really think about what made a strong evidence, a strong claim, evidence, and reasoning, and what was a strong counterclaim and critique. And then on day 4, when they come in, they're really getting ready to write. So on day 4, they look at a mentor text. In this case, this mentor text is a letter to the National Museum of the American Indian about which sources should best show the causes of the Trail of Tears. This one is about Cherokee removal. Once they've had a chance to analyze that mentor text, which is really nice because they're able to look at it and pick out the claim and the reason and the evidence, then they spend some time getting ready to write. So they have a graphic organizer to help them plan where they can really lay out their claim, their evidence, and their reasoning. It's nice. You have sentence stems built right into the graphic organizer. And some useful language. So this really gives them some sentence stems to start thinking about how do people in the social sciences introduce claims, evidence, and reasoning. And when they come in on day 5, they're really ready to go. They also, by the way, have a chance to go back and look at that useful language in the mentor text as well, which is helpful. On day 5, they come in, they use their planning graphic organizer and useful language chart to write their drafts. They get a chance to reflect on their writing with a partner, and then they share out with a couple of students. And then if you choose to do this in your context, you can actually make a choice of which letters are the strongest, which kids think are the strongest, and have those as the ones you would send authentically. That's obviously up to your choice within your own classroom and whether that works for your context. So you can see that is going to take, that's designed to be a week of instruction. And you might find that you end up going a little bit longer than that. Again, you have a choice to shorten sources. If you don't want to use all of them, there are recommended sources to use if you just want to use a handful rather than the full set. So lesson 4 transitions students, I think, really nicely into looking at what was going on with the Underground Railroad in Michigan. So what is the hidden story of Michigan's role in the Underground Railroad? Students learn about the Underground Railroad in elementary school, so they usually come in with some information, but this is an area that they haven't always looked at yet. So at the beginning of this 2-day lesson, we actually take advantage on day 1 to look at some of the intersections of work and the different reform movements. So we have them look at the reform movements they've studied so far and see where they're crossing each other. And we also make sure that we frame Northern abolition as not being uniformly against slavery. So not all Northerners were supportive of abolition. I guess that's what I'm really trying to say. Not all Northerners are supportive of abolition, and not all who supported abolition supported racial equality. So not everyone's an abolitionist, and those who are not in agreement about whether racial equality should be a goal of the movement. So it's really actually quite a complex movement in the North. On day 1 of this lesson, we have students start by pulling out their unit graphic organizers because there are 4 lessons in at this point. And we have them looking for some commonalities and differences in strategies and tactics across the movements. So giving them a chance to really think through what did movements have in common and what made some of these movements unique. We next have the students do a background reading about abolitionism in the North. And actually they also have have a chance to look at some sources. This is a primary source, John C. Calhoun's speech, which was Slavery as a Positive Good in 1837. It obviously has an important headnote, so students know the context of this and who Calhoun was, they've been introduced to him in prior units as well. We have them look at a memorial card for Elijah Lovejoy, who was killed in the North. He was an abolitionist who was killed. What we're really having students have a chance to look at is the varied responses to abolitionism, that this was not a movement that everybody agreed with in the country, and certainly not something everybody agreed with in the North. We then transition students into looking at a map of the Underground Railroad. We do introduce them to the metaphor of the Underground Railroad just to make sure all students understand it was not literally a railroad underground, because that's something they could come in thinking. Students then do a little bit of a background reading about the Underground Railroad, and we dispel as part of that reading the misconception that the majority of enslaved people were able to escape on the Underground Railroad. That is something that students often think. They think, well, almost everybody escaped on the Underground Railroad. So we actually show them a really nice graphic to point out the fact that not only did most people not escape on the Underground Railroad, most people didn't even attempt to escape. So for obviously a variety of reasons. So that the Underground Railroad, while noteworthy, was certainly not something that was used by every enslaved person in the country. The students then watch a TED Ed talk about Harriet Tubman and her contributions to U.S. history. And they end the day by going home and asking their caregivers about what they know about Michigan's role in the Underground Railroad. When they come in on day 2, they share out if their caregivers knew anything about Michigan's role, and if they did, what it was. And then we have them do a visual thinking strategy to reflect on the Gateway to Freedom International Memorial in Detroit. So this memorial sits right on the Detroit River. We show students the front and the back of it. And after they do the VTS strategy, they engage in a stations activity where they learn more about Michigan's role and probably some things they didn't know. So in the stations activity, they look at a news report, they look at some maps, they look at some articles, and they look at a handbill. And as they do, they complete a graphic organizer where they know, what did you learn about Michigan's role and what evidence from the station helps you support that claim. We have kids at the end of that station activity think about, now that they've gathered this evidence of the hidden history, based on the responses they learned about during homework the night before, whether they think Michigan's role is hidden. Did most of their caregivers know the things that they just investigated or not? And of course, we have the students return to their unit graphic organizer at the end of the lesson. So the final lesson of the unit, because again, this is a 5-lesson unit. It's just 3 weeks. Students engage in an inquiry about the women's rights movement. This is set up as an inquiry in the IDM blueprint. So it will look very similar in setup to the inquiry students did in Unit 5 about slavery. One thing to point out as you look at the compelling question and the supporting questions is that the supporting questions are designed to grow in complexity as students move through them. We really wanted to make sure that as part of this, we not only had kids learn about the history of the women's rights movement, but that we challenged the traditional narrative as the only one. So those were some of the goals heading in. The compelling question for this inquiry is, how should the history of the women's rights movement be remembered? Students start in the first supporting question. They look at what legal limitations women were already facing in the mid-1800s. They look at what the goals of the women's rights movement were and how those intersected with other movements. Of course, you very likely know, if you've taught 8th grade for a while, one of the movements it intersected with was the abolitionist movement. A lot of people who were involved in the women's rights movement were also involved in abolitionism. What strategies and tactics did women use to obtain these rights? Some will sound familiar and some are unique to the movement. And what are the existing narratives about the women's rights movement? I think this question is really interesting for kids to look at, because it's, what are the narratives that are being told right now about the women's rights movement, and are those comprehensive? So gives kids a chance to really think about an authentic question of the discipline right now. Students start with it. There's a couple of options for you to stage the question. Again, this is just a quick activity to get kids interested in the inquiry's topic. There's a chance to show a couple of different videos and you get to choose which one. Then students work their way through the 4 supporting questions. Again, as we've talked about before with the IDM blueprint, it's up to you how you structure this. You could choose to set the sources up in a stations activity. They could be a gallery walk. You could have kids sit in groups and give each group the sources and have them analyze those together. Some of these could be done individually and then kids pull back together. You really have a lot of flexibility in how students work through these sources. And you certainly also know your class context best in terms of whether students need more scaffolding or less scaffolding. As you can see, as you look across these sources, there's really a variety. So there are primary source descriptions of women's roles in the 18th and 19th century America. There's just some secondary source readings to build background knowledge. Students look at excerpts of letters. They look at an excerpt of the Declaration of Sentiments and the Declaration of Independence. They look at some speeches. They watch some video clips. So there are an array of sources. All of these sources have already been adapted for 8th grade. Of course, if you think they need to be adapted further, that's something you absolutely can do and should do. At the end of investigating these 4 supporting questions, students come back and they write an argument to that to the compelling question, which is how should the history of the women's rights movement be remembered? The extension to this inquiry has kids look at limitations women are facing today in the country. And then their taking informed action option is to craft a more robust narrative of the women's rights movement and convey it to an authentic audience. So what would be a robust narrative of this movement now that they've deepened their knowledge, and who could they share that narrative with? And just a side note, all of the sources and graphic organizers and activities are all included for you. So everything is in there. There's nothing you need to get on your own. And like I said before, and I'll just scroll back quickly, certainly you know your students. And if you think, for instance, that working through the first set of sources with them to show them how this is set up and how it's going to work, you can absolutely do that. And you can see whether you think students are, what the best context is to set up the analysis of the remainder of the sources. Okay, the final piece of the unit, of course, is the summative performance task. So it follows very much in line with what you're used to seeing in these units. Students construct an argument to that compelling question for the unit about what it takes to build justice in a democratic society. The extension option for the summative performance test has kids look at current areas of society where they see injustice, to look at their historical roots and determine possible ways to start to address those to build justice, and then to implement a plan of action that they think has the greatest likelihood of succeeding. My gosh, and we're already through because it's a 3-week unit, so it's a little faster. Our next meeting is scheduled for February 16th, which is a Thursday, again from 4:30 to 5:30 p.m. on Zoom. And just a reminder that as you work through this unit, if you have any questions at all as you're looking through the lesson plans or the materials, the slide decks, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm going to put my contact information up there. Excuse me. I'm happy to answer any questions you have. I'm happy to walk you through any lesson or any of the resources. And our team is happy to come out to your classroom and help you implement a lesson. If you are trying something new and you want someone there to help walk you through the lesson as you instruct it with students, we would love to do that. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're here to help in any way that we can. And I hope that you have a great rest of the night.